Is astrology a religion? That is the title of my topic this afternoon. And I was thinking earlier of spoiling it by giving you my answer, but I think I won't. I'll let you labor through the lecture. How's that? Now, the other day, I mentioned that I have one incredibly Aristotelian attribute, which is before I go into a discussion, I like to have some idea what the terms mean. The amount of breeze and breath and argumentative fury that has been spent over people arguing about something when they don't even know that they're using the terms in the same way is incredible. And the thing you have to understand about this is many arguments can be solved simply by discovering that you're saying the same thing with different words. This is especially true in astrology. Can you hear me, by the way? Okay. Yes. Good. Okay. Here, I'm not defining Greek. Let me make that clear. I'm defining the Greek word for religion, which is sebas, as in Sebastian. That's a name derived from this. One who has reverence. Reverential awe that prevents one from doing something disgraceful. Reverence, worship, honor, the object of reverential awe, holiness, majesty. This emphasizes, as my comment says, the moral aspect of religion and the relation of a subject, humanity, to a king, God. One could argue that religion of this kind is, I would argue, in fact, I will argue that religion of this kind is a vast projection of the parent-child relationship onto the cosmos, which is supported by reference to God or gods as our Father. Progenitor, I suppose, is a better word, because whatever it is, it came first and it generated us, or caused us directly or indirectly to be generated. But that it's the masculine parent is not, in my mind, questionable. It's wrong. In fact, to think of it as a parent in human terms is completely distorting. This is a beautiful example of Voltaire's famous statement, God created man in his image, and man returned the compliment. If you've never heard that, it's a great line. Substituting for the mother does not radically alter this problem. So, the situation in Latin is far murkier, because there are two derivations for the word religion in Latin, neither of which, one doesn't make sense and the other one I think is wrong, mainly because there's a grammatical problem with it. It's usually defined as being derived from religo, to bind back. Hence, religio sometimes means the same as obligatio, and that's just what it looks like, obligation. So religion is obligation. Oh, that is so useful. Do any of you remember when you were teenagers and you acted a little out of order? And your parents said, or your teacher said, act more responsibly. That means do what I tell you. That's not responsibility. That's servitude. Responsibility means that when you have made an error, you own it. When you're inclined to blame somebody else for something that's happened to you, you look to see what you could have done that made the situation occur. That's responsibility. But following other people's orders is not responsibility. And religion should not merely be about acting as, at most, an adolescent in the face of an angry parent. I think you can tell I am not too big on Judeo-Christian religion. The other derivation is from relego, as opposed to religo, and there is a participle derived from it, R-E-L-I-G-E-N-S, religions, if you use the medieval pronunciation, revering the gods, i.e. pious religious. There's just one problem. Very seldom in Latin does an E in that position, in a verb, turn into an I in the participle. The participle of relego should be relegans. So even the dictionary, well, I won't say even the dictionary and I agree, that looks bogus. So here we are. We have this word religion, which has come from outer space into the Latin language, and from there into ours. Fortunately, even if we don't know what the Latin word originally meant, we know what it means to most moderns and in the middle. So, as I always do in this, I go to the ultimate referee of the English language, the complete Oxford English Dictionary. No, I don't own it, I go online. Or at least I used to. I don't have an account anymore because I'm no longer at a university. But I downloaded this before I left school. Action or conduct, indicating a belief in, reverence for, and desire to please a divine ruling power. The exercise or practice of rites or observances, definitely tired, implying this. Also in the plural, religious rites, now rare except as implied in C below. By the way, this numbering system is not the same as the one in the OED. I had to renumber it. Otherwise, I would have had to include a lot of irrelevant passages. B, a particular system of faith and worship. Now, here we come to a particular problem with the idea of religion in the West. Its identification with a belief system. As I said yesterday, do you believe in astrology? And the answer is, I hope not. You should know it. It is my humble opinion that religion is about knowledge and consciousness, not about God is a pile of turtles rotating counterclockwise. That is almost as reasonable as the doctrine of the Trinity. I'm not saying there aren't three aspects to God, but if you ever look up the theology of the doctrine of the Trinity, your head will be spinning by the time it's over. And that doctrine has been the most common cause of heresies because people say, this is crazy. Or they propose something else equally crazy but different. Recognition on the part of man, that is humanity, of some higher unseen power as having control of his destiny and as being entitled to obedience, reverence, and worship. The first part of this definition actually is rather relevant to astrology. Recognition on the part of man of some higher unseen power as having control of his destiny. The second part, and as being entitled to obedience, reverence, and worship, is up for grabs. You don't have to worship the planets. It's just simply a matter, if you don't pay any attention to the symbolism of what you're dealing with, you're probably going to get the worst possible manifestation. So it doesn't demand obedience. Common sense demands it, but not obedience in a blind sense. Astrology demands that you understand the energies, you see how they work within you, and you choose a path that embodies the highest possible manifestation of those energies. Needless to say, when you're in a state of fear, craziness, anxiety, upset, or just plain stupidity, you're not going to do that. And I will deal with that at the end of this talk. I grafted part of the tail end of my Corpus Hermeticum and astrology onto the end of this talk because I didn't get to deal with it as thoroughly as I would have liked this morning, and it is relevant to this talk. Finally, recognition on the part of man of some higher unseen power as having control of his destiny and as being entitled to, sorry, this is the one I've been reading already, so, as I said. Okay, the general mental and moral attitude resulting from this belief with reference to its effect upon the individual or the community, personal or general acceptance of this feeling as a standard of spiritual and practical life. And here we have the community aspect of religion. Everybody must believe the same thing so we can all get along and be happy and pay our taxes to the state and church, which really is what's behind this, I think, but that's all right. I'm a little cynical, and yet you will see that I'm not by the time I'm finished. Here's from the Encyclopedia Britannica, relatively recent version, human beings' relation to that which they regard as holy, sacred, spiritual, or divine. The main problem here, by the way, is having defined religion in these words, you then have to ask, what does holy, sacred, spiritual, or divine mean? It's what they called in Latin a petitio principis, which we translate in English as begging the question. It's not exact translation, but it's the same idea. Religion is commonly regarded as consisting of a person's relation to God or to gods or spirits. Worship is probably the most basic element of religion, but moral conduct, right belief, participation in religious institutions are also generally constituent elements of the religious life, etc., etc. Buddhists in the room, does this sound like an accurate description of what you do? Does it? That fundamentally it's about getting along in the community, having the same belief as everybody else? Is it primarily about morality, or is it primarily about consciousness? Notice the omission of that whole idea in all of these definitions. These definitions are remarkably and strictly Judeo-Christian Islamic. I put the three of them together because they all have the same tendency. Now, and I say that in the next slide, really. These definitions are all completely dependent upon exoteric, conventional, and historically Western religions. These have noted only mystical unions in the above list, in one of the definitions I did not give you, and such notice has usually been treated with suspicion, if not outright hostility. Oh yes, Aldous Huxley. Remember Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, and of course his only religious book, The Perennial Philosophy. One of his critics, having read all of Aldous Huxley's earlier works, he said, "It is a shame that this fine young mind has gotten perverted by cloudy mysticism." That's not an exact quote, but it gives you the general idea. There's a great suspicion of mysticism in the West. Also a total lack of understanding. Now, one could extend, as I say in this slide, the idea implicit in the OED section C to include all of those enlightenment-oriented techniques as being forms of adjustment to higher powers. But, and this is a huge point, I think it was the late Joseph Campbell, among others, who pointed out a fundamental difference between Western and Eastern religion. When I say Western, I mean the dominant ones. In the West, there have been a number of currents about which what I'm about to say is not true. How'd you like that convoluted phrase? Up with which I shall not put. That's a Winston Churchill line. He said, "Putting participles at the end of a sentence is something up with which I shall not put." And he was making the point that sometimes you just got to do it. So, the problem, according to Campbell, and I think he's got it absolutely right, in the original Jungian sense of the terms, Western religion is extroverted and Eastern religion is introverted. Now, that doesn't mean that Western religion is happy and gay and jolly. Good God, it certainly doesn't. And it doesn't mean that Eastern religion is sort of moody and gloomy and hanging around and being depressed. That, by the way, I would describe not as the Jungian definition, but as the American definition. Although you will find it in psychological literature from elsewhere as well. The Jungian idea of extroversion is that the religion places the emphasis on everything that is completely external. God is out there. The truth is out there. What's in here simply is supposed to go into conformity with it. And this is characteristic, actually, of the Jungian version of the extroverted personality. They look to the social group to find their norms. They're very happy when they're with the social group. I'm not saying that extroverts are necessarily stupid or conformist, but their approach to the truth is externalist, whatever that may mean for the individual. The Eastern religions are introverted in that the truth is within, God is within, and you go inward in order to find these things. This is generally true, however, of all mystical systems. They're all introverted. The extroverted ones can be best described as primitive humanity. In fact, I actually saw this explanation on a French documentary about the origins of religion. I'm not making this one up. That shows a primitive man who is hovering, fearing in the environment. You can see they hadn't hung around too many primitive men, but and a lightning bolt occurs, and he goes, "Oh, that must be divine," and he's terrified. So he builds a religion in order to placate this thing. Is that absolutely wrong? Probably not. But to ascribe the origin of all religion to that is again falling into the Western fallacy. The enlightened individual is not pulled forward to enlightenment or to self-realization. He is not pulled forward by revealed laws and decrees, but moves forward as if impelled by an inner process of unfolding. That is an introverted point of view. Oddly enough, the acorn turning into an oak tree is an introvert. Nobody say, hey acorn, you got to grow now, you got to be an oak tree. The acorn says, I will be an oak tree. It is my destiny. Or it gets eaten by a squirrel. I got the hit that. Now I can see my keyboard. So, all of the definitions and characterizations of religion mentioned above, including an addenda which was back there somewhere, but it's unimportant, imply that at the center or beginning of all being is an entity or entities that are in some meaningful sense alive and conscious, or in some higher state of existence that both transcends and subsumes life and consciousness and being as we experience them. That's about the biggest best general description I can make of whatever you call, the term I coined for this is the summum. Another good term, which means whatever sort of subsumes everything else, and it somehow sums up everything else. Another good term is the Greek word arche, from which is an archetype, which means a beginning principle. In fact, principle is one of its translations into Latin and English. A beginning principle that initiates the entire unfolding process of creation. So whatever you consider the summum to be, all of these definitions I have stated do assume that the summum is something alive and not a machine. That puts it most starkly. That's starkly, not darkly. Yes, okay. Decided to bring out my timer. Okay. None of the, except a little bit of 1C from back a couple of slides, none of these definitions imply that religion requires a vast and complex socio-political organization such as the Roman Catholic Church and other Christian churches. Even Islam doesn't have that. But you have to understand something about Christianity. It became the official religion of the Roman Empire. So what did it do? It organized itself exactly like the late Roman Empire. The Pope is the Augustus, one of whose titles, by the way, was Pontifex Maximus. I don't know if you're aware of that. The emperor was always the biggest bridge maker. That's what that word means. Because the original Roman Pontifex Maximus was the person who made sure the bridges were maintained, and that gradually fell to the office of the priest of Jupiter, and I think you can see how it morphed into a title given to the Pope. But calling the Pope the Pontiff is really kind of strange, because I don't think any of them have ever had anything to do with building bridges, literally or metaphorically. The Muslim religion has a radically different kind of organization. In fact, oddly enough, Islam is one of the few functioning anarchies on the planet. Now, an anarchy does not mean craziness and chaos. That's a slur. An anarchy means there is no centralized government. It has another characteristic too. It governs by consensus, not by decree or majority rule. Democratic government is not anarchic. A good example of an anarchy that you may encounter if they're over here, I don't know, is the Society of Friends to be found in South Africa?
Yeah.
Good, okay. That is an anarchy. Because if you go to a Quaker meeting, once a month they take the Sunday morning service time and devote it to the monthly meeting. And the monthly meeting and all other meetings, nobody ever takes a vote. They talk about an issue and talk about an issue until finally they reach a consensus, and that is what they do. If even one person refuses to agree, they will say, okay, let us go home and come back next month and think about it and ask ourselves the question, is our position dictated by egoistic considerations, or are we really feeling the way we feel because of our opinion of what is best for the community? And they don't say which position represents which of those. I've seen this personally, that's why I know. And by and large, if it doesn't work out a month later, they drop it. This is not for things like, do we want to install a fire alarm system in the meeting house? That they probably would leave to an administrator who would present a case to the congregation, and the congregation would then accept or reject the proposal on the same basis that I just described. But mostly they would probably accept it, unless one of them happened to own a rival fire alarm company that wasn't being employed, I suppose. Many religions are bound together quite loosely in terms of political organization, and involvement in any kind of spiritual belief or practice is a form of religion, even if it is only a personal one. I'm constantly having this problem with clients. I say, what religion or spiritual path do you follow? Oh, I don't follow any. Do you have a spiritual practice? Yes, I meditate regularly, I do yoga. That is a spiritual practice. They're thinking, do I go somewhere every Sunday or Saturday and hang out with a group of fellow believers? It's a totally Western idea, all because the church organized itself along the lines of the late Roman Empire. By the way, you may be interested in knowing that the major subdivisions of the two halves of the late Roman Empire were called dioceses. So the archbishop happens to correspond to the diocesan governor of the empire. The Catholic Church, and to a lesser extent the Orthodox Church, are the last surviving bastions of Roman imperial government. And in fact, in the last century and a half, the Catholic Church has become more imperial, not less. Whether that will survive the current Pope, I don't know. He's definitely different. Okay. Now, having defined religion, sort of, let's see how astrology stacks up. Let's define astrology in terms of being a philosophy or a religion. I'm not trying to define astrology in terms of what it does. The basic idea, astrology is a system of ideas which attempts to discern, analyze, and utilize correlations between human and terrestrial affairs with the changes of positions of the heavenly bodies, especially the planets. Anybody have a problem with that definition? Feel free to say so. I got a microphone here that will catch you if you do. Okay. I may say some things you might disagree with, but I hope that isn't one of them, because it's pretty general. Astrological interactions and correlations can be described as signs, that is, signals of the nature of a particular point in time and space. There may or may not be any physical interaction, but the process of an astrological reading does indeed resemble reading more than scientific analysis. I would say reading and translating would be even more accurate, because basically you read the chart and translate the chart into English. And if you don't translate the chart into English, you're going to have one hell of an unhappy client. I don't care if I've got Sun square Jupiter, what the hell does it mean? And he or she is perfectly entitled to ask that question. I get it quite frequently, because I go off on my technical excursions, but then I always come back, okay, this means blah, 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 for you. Efficient causation. Now, this is a word I need to characterize. You all know what causation means generally, right? A makes B happen. Well, the Latin word for make in that usage is efficio, which means effect. And the other adjective is efficient. So when I say efficient causation, I mean ordinary causation. The reason I put the adjective in front is because I firmly agree with Aristotle, here I go again, that there are at least three other kinds: formal, material, and final. The formal cause is the form that an object is assuming as it evolves. The final cause is to assume that form as completely as possible, and the efficient cause is the life energy of the being in question. The material cause is, of course, the matter out of which the entity is made. So the acorn, our friend the acorn, has DNA within it that is a program that will cause the acorn to move toward the manifestation of the form oak tree. And we can call it a form because it's implicit in the DNA. Does the DNA cause it? Well, yeah, you can describe it that way, but you can also think of the oak tree archetype as pulling the acorn toward it. And the means is the DNA. What is the reason the acorn is doing this? To become an oak tree so it can continue to propagate acorns. You've heard the joke that a chicken is the means by which eggs reproduce? Or is the egg the way a chicken reproduces? It all depends on your point of view, doesn't it? Okay. Final causation is what it's doing in the long run, and that I've already described as making more acorns. And let's see, what's the one I've left out? Material, of course, is the cellulose material out of which the acorn is made. I guess that covers it. But here's something you may find rather mind-blowing. According to Aristotle, when you take these four causes to a living being, the material cause of the living being is the cells out of which the living being is made. The efficient cause is the soul. The formal cause is the soul. The final cause is the manifestation of the soul as nearly perfectly as possible. And before you say, how can this be a cause, I need to let you know that there is this new entity in scientific thought called a strange attractor. And a strange attractor appears to be a cause that operates from the future rather than the past. That is exactly what a final cause is. A cause that operates from the future rather than the past. So they have found the need to restore this concept, but of course they had to rename it because one of the articles of scientific philosophy is that Aristotle was wrong on everything except maybe logic. And I have to admit, he did have an amazing tendency to take ideas that were essentially accurate and disprove them. He wasn't always right either, but I think this is one case where he may have had something going. But the main reason why the scientific community can't accept that idea is that it implies living beings. Now, Aristotle did not take a formal position on the question of whether the universe was composed entirely out of life energy, but some other people certainly did. And Aristotle probably thought to himself, well, I don't really need to get into this. All I need to say is that if you don't look at these issues, you will not understand the development of a biological entity. In case you haven't noticed, we are all biological entities. What you probably haven't noticed is so is everything else. There is nothing dead or inert in this world. And that's the heresy that science cannot accept. And by the way, this is not a tendency. This is a formal part of the program as defined by the founding fathers of science in the late 17th and early 18th century. No vitalistic explanations for anything. They had a good reason, and it was a good reason, but it's no longer appropriate. Okay, so now looking at these things in terms of astrology, 616, okay. So I just quote again without the earlier comment, the definition again: reverential awe that prevents one from doing something disgraceful, reverence, worship, honor the object of reverential awe, holiness, majesty. Comparison with astrology. That quotation mark shouldn't be there. One may feel something like these when confronted by the symbolism of astrology, and many have. Do you remember the first time you came to the conclusion that astrology might work and you went, oh my God? Any of you remember that moment? Yeah.
You still get it.
Yeah. Every time I make an accurate prediction, I go, oh my God. I'll never get over it. It's not like I blow it regularly, so I'm amazed when I get it right. But sometimes you say something that is so specific. You ask yourself, how the hell did I do that? I don't know. I have some ideas, but there's a component to astrology that is not strictly speaking astrological. That's one of the reasons we can have all these systems, and every one of them seems to reinforce the acceptance of the person practicing it. My only request is that before you go on to a psychic field day, that you have used as much astrological method as possible to correct for things like the barometric pressure, your current emotional state, or other problems that might cause you not to intuit correctly. That's the main advantage astrology has over most other divinatory techniques. And this word divinatory causes people a lot of trouble. Divinatory means, divining means finding out what the divine is doing. Of course, that makes a postulate too, that astrologers are one of those groups involved in finding out what the divine is doing. Notice I didn't say what the divine was. One can also, however, have such feelings when confronted by magnificent natural phenomena. You know, that feeling of awe. Well, that's sebas too. Or sebas, rather. Yeah, sebas, accent on the first syllable. In neither case does this require or imply a moral code or canons of behavior. So, whatever sort of powerful feeling you get from astrology, the moral code implication and canons of behavior is not there. As a matter of fact, as are all quite aware if we've read anything of the history of astrology, astrology may be used for truly nefarious purposes. And this might be a good time to tell you the story of assassination by electional astrology. This is true. I found this in my doctoral research. I'll give the short version. There was a very wicked man named Ezzelino da Romano III, or I should say Terzio if I want to be totally Italian. And he was making a shambles out of northern Italy in his attempt to conquer the whole thing and bring it under his personal rule. And quite aside from the fact that his ambitions were rather megalomaniacal, he was a very evil man. In one particular case, he wiped out the aristocracy of an entire town, killed them all, just because he didn't want anybody giving him a hard time. And they hadn't given him one either. That was the horrible part. He was fond of astrology because his mother was into astrology very deeply. She forecast accurately the date of her own death. And she forecast that her sons would grow up to be very powerful men in northern Italy. She even mentioned some important places that would be concerned in their lifetimes, and all of this came to pass. She left out the little part of what happens next. I can see why she might have, too. A North Italian monk named Rolandino of Padua recorded this entire history. So did a couple of others. But to make a long story short, I have to intermediate story first. Rolandino assembled Ezzelino, too many E-notes here, Ezzelino assembled a group of astrologers to give him guidance on just about everything he did. They didn't want to work for him. He was a right bastard, as they say in England and Australia. Maybe you do too here, I don't know. Which means true bastard. He was feared by all, so he assembled his astrologers by kidnapping an important member of each one's family and imprisoning them, and if the astrologer didn't play ball, the relative would die, slowly and horribly. One of the leading groups, he got his brother. So these people did not, shall we say, have a really good reason to like this man. So in the last year of his life, thanks to the astrologers, he asked his astrologers to assemble a date and time for the beginning of his march through the campaign to finally conquer Padua. And Rolandino gives the chart. He doesn't give it in detail, but he gives the ascending sign, he gives the signs of the sun, moon, and planets, and we know the date. So it was not difficult to cobble together an actual chart. The ascendant may not be in the right degree, but it's the right sign rising, and if you happen to be a devotee of whole sign houses, that will do. Here's what happened. The march began on schedule, all the soldiers dressed in their finest finery, marching in grand procession across the countryside with everybody appropriately awe-stricken. And when the battle began, not too long after the battle began, Etzalino was shot in the heel by an arrow, taken prisoner, and put into a dungeon where he died several weeks later of unknown causes. Now, and then Rolandino has a lot of fun at the expense of the astrologers because they did such a rotten job of electing the chart. Well, when I erected the chart, I found out 3 of the planets were in the wrong signs. And one of them was the ruler of the ascendant. He had Jupiter in Libra when it was in fact in Scorpio with Sagittarius rising. Would you put, if you were electing something for someone, the ruler of the person who is asking you for the date in the 12th house? And the moon was moving into, the moon which ruled the 8th was moving into a square of that Jupiter. Now, it gets better. Did I say, yeah, Sagittarius was rising, right, okay. When a planet is in the 12th sign from its own sign, you don't know this from modern astrology, but believe me, it's all over the traditional book starting with the Greeks. When a planet is in the 12th sign from its own sign, it rules the feet. And Sagittarius is rising, which, as Rolandino did notice, has something to do with arrows. Remember the archer? Of course, it isn't the constellation, it's the sign. And of course, the Mars was in on this too, and Mars ruled the 12th. To make a long story short, now I will make it short. If you take the delineations of the characteristics of this chart and look them up in Bonatti, you will get man will be shot in the heel, thrown into prison, and will die. It's right there. That was what was striking. I didn't have to interpret. I could look it up in a cookbook and get that answer. Which leads me to only one conclusion. They did it deliberately. They wanted to get rid of the guy, so they gave him the electional chart from hell. And they knew damn well what it would mean. And it happened. One of these days I'm going to write a journal article about this, but I may have a little trouble getting it published. I mean, for a straight history journal. I would say, what an interesting coincidence we have here, you know. I don't really believe in this stuff, I just study it, you know. That's the, and I don't believe in it, I know it. Okay, the Latin word, derived from religo, to bind back. Hence, religio sometimes means the same as obligation. Astrology does indeed bind back, but in such a way as to make the individual part of and tied into the cosmos. Now, in fact, it does this more so than most religions do. Astrology does not do this by imposing obligations, although every so often a chart will make an offer you shouldn't refuse. But that's not an obligation. You have the freedom to ignore the chart, as long as you take responsibility, and I mean that in the sense I said earlier. As to the second possible derivation of religio, the same comments apply to it as to the Greek word sebas. Sebas, I keep getting that pronunciation wrong. 626, okay. Regarding the OED definitions, we are, just to refresh your memory, action or conduct indicating a belief in, reverence for, and desire to please the divine ruling power. The exercise or practice of rites or observances implying this. And my first comment is the way I really feel, and I hope you don't find it too harsh. All of this is very much about placating something that is running the equivalent of a cosmic protection racket. Do what I say or you will suffer. We were just talking earlier today about fundamentalists, and one of the people I was talking to had a friend or a relative, forgive me if I don't have the details right if you're here, who was told that, it was her sister. her sister told her she was going to burn in hell. Now, is that not a protection racket? Astrology necessitates no ritual or rites that may serve to signify belief in or reverence for such a power. Astrology. I don't mean that astrology can't be used for this purpose, but astrology itself doesn't. Although at various times in various places such rituals and rites have existed, but this was not because astrology was part of a religion, This was because astrology was part of a religion, not a religion in itself. And three obvious examples come to mind. The late Roman religion of the unconquered sun used astrology in designing its rituals. Hindu astrology is used in religion, as we saw gloriously demonstrated yesterday. And of course, Babylonian astrology also served to make rituals to placate the planetary deities. So astrology can most definitely be part of a religion, no argument. Then we have the second definition, a particular system of faith and worship. Astrology is experiential. It is not about anything revealed that one has to believe in. You do have to stop disbelieving in something, all right, but you don't have to believe in anything. Go out, try it, see if it works. Or as they used to say in the advertising industry, run it up the flagpole and see if anybody salutes. Again, worship is not an inherent part of astrology. It may be associated with it, but it's not an inherent part. And OED 3, recognition on the part of man of some higher unseen powers having control of his destiny. I've already mentioned this. The passage from recognition to destiny is certainly part of astrology. The rest of this definition is not usually characteristic of astrology at all. And the Britannica definition. Human beings' relation to that which they regard as holy, sacred, spiritual, or divine. And I say that's a very broad definition and could possibly describe an attitude toward astrology. Except for one thing, as I mentioned earlier, what do they mean by holy, sacred, spiritual, or divine? I don't mean those words are meaningless, but those are a beautiful set of words that people use thinking that they're all agreeing on the meaning when in fact they don't. That's why I went into such trouble to take some standard authoritative quote-unquote definitions at the beginning. Do I necessarily believe that those definitions constitute a valid definition of religion? No. But the remaining part that they have not touched, which is the self-realization part, and the search for enlightenment, or rather the process of becoming enlightened. If you're seeking enlightenment, by the way, you're doomed. Give up. Then you may become enlightened. Because it's the ego that wants to seek enlightenment, and that's the very thing that's in the way. So I'm not being morbid. I really mean you have to let go of the issue. You may practice rituals and ceremonies, as the Hindus do, that will put you in the right frame of mind, but you must enjoy the ritual for its own sake, not because it is going to make you enlightened. You can also meditate. Again, you have to meditate for its own sake. If you don't enjoy meditating, for God's sakes, don't do it. Find something else. You must like what you do, even if it can regard strain and work, but you must like it. It must be, must be able to feel that it's doing something good for you, even if you don't know what it is. I'm sure there are people in the spiritual community that will disagree with these sentiments, but this brings me to a statement I'm fond of making about systems of enlightenment. That I do not want to take a picture. I want to know what time it is. 6:31. Okay. I have found that most religions and systems of enlightenment fall into two broad schools. I call them the flow school and the bust your ass school. The flow school consists of people who believe in let go, let God, which is the one I was just expressing, actually. It doesn't mean you don't do anything, but you don't struggle toward the objective of enlightenment. You just do the thing that makes your mind expand and grow because you want to. The bust your ass school will pick up all kinds of methods and techniques, and they will labor intensively in order to achieve enlightenment through these techniques. This is not, by the way, despite my recent comments, my comments of just a moment ago, necessarily the wrong thing to do. It may be a really great device for tricking your ego into letting go. But the second stage has to be flow school. Or as I like to put it with Pisces and Sagittarius, Sagittarius, and I know this from personal experience, builds elaborate structures and platforms to climb up in its search for enlightenment, and then when it gets to the top it realizes it has to jump. Pisces just jumps. That's another characterization of the two schools. The rest of this sentence, this Britannica definition was starting over. The rest of this paragraph is a characterization of religion in completely Judeo-Christian Islamic religious terms. It does not especially apply to astrology. Oh, the second part of the Britannica definition, that's right. I don't think this should be there. No, we'll just pass over that one. Now, believe it or not, we're getting pretty close to the end of this talk, but we can have discussion and questions for a change. Astrology is not a religion in the usual sense of the word, especially the formal senses of the word, but it has implications for religion, and some religions have implications for it as well. It supports the basic idea of something either alive, etc., or something which transcends and subsumes all life and consciousness, which is at the center of everything. Astrology otherwise does not make any explicit religious statements. However, there can be, have been, and are religions that incorporate astrology as part of its cosmology, both negatively and positively. This morning I talked about Hermeticism, which is ambiguous on the issue as to whether the stars were a barrier or a means to salvation or enlightenment, but there are others where it is a means primarily, and there are others where it is always a barrier. Astrology, now here are some major points which need to be made because an awful lot of people are unclear on the concept. Astrology is not essentially in conflict with any religions except, number one, those which explicitly deny that there can be any kind of astrological phenomena as such for whatever reason. This includes, most especially, mechanist materialist systems. Is scientism a religion? Oh yeah, it fills all the criteria. It is not, science is not scientism, but the religion of science is scientism. And for those of you that don't remember what I said this yesterday, I think it was, from Houston Smith, that scientism is the philosophical statement that there is no valid method of finding the truth about anything except the scientific method. Since this has not been arrived at by the scientific method, it contradicts the scientific method and therefore has to be considered false, according to the scientific method, or at least unproven. But you know, when you get outside of your specialty, you are often inconsistent about applying the terms of that specialty. Now, the irony of the mechanistic view that the universe is meaningless has always struck me. If the universe, if we are insignificant, to whom are we insignificant? If you don't believe in any kind of higher living power, to whom are we insignificant? Because the only thing that can assign significance is a conscious being. And if we are the only conscious being in towns, then by God, we are not insignificant. So they're implying that there is an objective criterion for significance when significance can only be given by a living being. Do you get it? And the second one is equally strange. Science is based on the idea that there is an absolutely real and true state of being called reality that exists independently of anyone who observes it. Now, that's the modern view. The original view was that the objectively real is the point of view and the vision by which God sees it. That's perfectly okay. We all see a limited portion of the truth, but God sees the whole thing. And science originally was trying to arrive at the same kind of understanding God had. This God, by the way, was one that did not interfere with normal human existence. This is what is known as the ultimate clockmaker. The universe is a giant clock, and after making it, God withdrew from the universe, and the clock's just been running ever since. That's a beautiful example of idolatry, by the way. Whenever we make up some new gadget, we start describing the universe in terms of it. Or either that, or we describe life in terms of it. How many of you have heard about the brain being described as a computer? Or the eye as a camera? Backwards. The point is, however, in a story memorialized by what I do not know if it's apocryphal or not, but it's historically accurate in terms of what it says. According to the story, Napoleon was having an interview. He was interviewing or talking to, I suppose, the scientist, the physicist Laplace. Now, in Ptolemy's explanation of the solar system, there was something missing. Jupiter and Saturn had patterns that, according to pure Newtonian mechanics, would eventually cause them to sort of go crazy and disappear from the solar system. And Newton himself took the position that every so often God has to intervene and reset the clock. He said it pretty much in those terms, too. Newton, by the way, was not an atheist. He was a Unitarian. For those of you that believe that Unitarians are not atheists. I don't believe they are, by the way. Though you've probably heard the great definition of Unitarianism, people who believe in at most one God. At any rate, so Newton did not remove God from the operation of the universe altogether. Laplace, however, discovered what is called the greater inequality, which was a completely mechanistic way of accounting for the unpredictable behavior of Jupiter and Saturn. And shortly after Laplace, somebody, of course they already had Uranus, two people postulated the positions of Neptune, and that took care of the remaining errors. Pluto was never really part of the problem because it's too small, although it took a long time before anybody realized that. At any rate, Laplace was describing the system to Napoleon, and Napoleon said, "Where does God fit into your ideas?" And Laplace said, "God? I have no need of that hypothesis." And at that moment, the idea of objectivity went right down the toilet and nobody ever noticed it. If there is nothing that can see the truth, there is no completely objective reality. There is only shareable consensus reality. There is no inherently objective reality. This begs the question for the moment of whether there is an objective anything, but that's another issue. So, our friends, the fanatical debunkers, espouse a philosophy which is full of oxymorons and stupidities, and for some reason nobody's called them on it. Here's what happened one time, though, when I started expressing some of these sentiments. I'm a scientist. We do not have a philosophy. Bullshit. They just don't know it. I applied this line in context to something else. I'm sure you've heard it. The fish will be the last to discover water. When you have a philosophy, you will be the last to discover that you have a philosophy unless you've adopted it consciously. And they didn't. Astrology is not essentially in conflict with any religions except, continuing the list, those that insist that astrology must be in league with the demonic or evil forces, that a priori astrology cannot be an indication of divine will. Augustine falls into this category, and the early church generally does. Later church did not. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam require that the planets not influence human beings so as to eliminate free will or contradict the will of God. free will, especially in Christianity and Islam, are requirements of religion, because how can you consign somebody to hell if they didn't even have a chance to choose? So quite legitimately, they insist on the freedom of the will. They may say it's difficult to do, and I'll agree, but they can't deny it. Anybody who believes, as Calvin did, that you are predestined from the very beginning by almost mechanistic laws by God to be either saved or damned, this is still the position of Calvinist religion, and some hold it quite literally. Here again, you don't have a chance, then the whole meaning of Christ coming to save you from your sins is kind of meaningless, isn't it? Calvin was not a nice man, nor was he very philosophically consistent. At any rate, those who are really more in touch with their religious position must deny astrological determinism. So with these religions, this should not be a source of conflict unless you are an astro-fatalist, in which case you've got a problem with these religions. Lilly's Christian Astrology was in part written to demonstrate, although it shows much more a demonstration of his incredible skill as an astrologer, but he wrote the book to show that astrology was not inconsistent with Christianity. And there are a couple of places where he actually does it without raising the flag of what he was doing. One particular case, I believe it's on page 50. Oh boy, you know you read a book when you can cite the page number. It's somewhere in the page, it's chapter 50, excuse me, book 2, chapter 50, where a young lady comes to him and asks whether she is going to indeed marry an older man that she's not very fond of. And she's hoping that he will come up with a negative answer. And he sure as hell did. A few weeks later, she came back to him saying she changed her mind. And Bonatti said, but I've told you the preponderance of the energy says that it can't happen. She said, look again. So he looked again. And he said, okay, if you follow my instructions exactly, you may be able to do it. He recommended a certain kind of person to act as an intermediary with a certain kind of relationship to the old man. This, by the way, was due to a translation of light going on, in case you're wondering where the symbolism comes from. Then you may get him to change his mind, but this is also all going on with minor dignities. The point is, with that kind of a setup, she'd have to try real hard and do things exactly right. She did, and it worked, but she was never happy because the chart was right. But he did show that astrology could always point to an alternative scenario by which something could be accomplished. The question that has to be asked is, should it be accomplished? Which is quite another issue. Okay. The Christian, and I think the Islamic religions took the same position, the Christian position on astrology was that it was okay as long as it did not interfere with free will, and so for this reason they had no problem whatsoever with its use in medicine. They had no problem whatsoever with its use in mundane astrology, because that's mass behavior, not individual. They were a little more hostile to natal astrology, but that was okay too if it could, if people could get alternate ways of dealing with the energies, which is pretty consistent with the way most of us do things. And horary, or interrogations as they are called in medieval astrology, were a little more suspect, because for that to work there has to be a pretty deterministic energy flowing. They were extremely okay with electional astrology, except one kind, which I'll mention in a moment. They were perfectly okay with electional astrology because it shows you had free will. The late Charles Jane, an American astrologer of some importance, his importance was that he inspired an awful lot of people to do very good work. His own astrology was a little idiosyncratic, although he has one devout follower in the person of Bill Meridian, who is very much into his eclipse theory, and that was probably his most important work, Jane's, I mean. So, at any rate, Charles used to say, electional astrology is stupid. He would pretty much put it in those terms. He was a man of few gentle words. Because either you're predestined to do it right or you're going to do it wrong. And if you're predestined to do it wrong, you will not be able to pick the right time. Actually, that's not as crazy as it sounds, although I disagree with it, actually. But I will say that you cannot tell the difference between a good election indicating that you're in tune with the universe, or you got to find the time and pick it, or the good election actually somehow or other signified that the outcome would be okay. It's getting really damp in here, isn't it? Okay. So I do believe that, in fact, electional astrology is a choice that is made somewhat by free will, but I will say this. If you do electional astrology for somebody, and I'll talk about this in a couple of days, somewhere in the next couple of days, and every election you pick can't be done, this is a really bad sign. Like some, of course, you have to do properly in order to make them happen. At any rate, here's the kind of electional astrology the church absolutely had no tolerance for. Picking times for making amulets or talismans. Picking times for doing rituals that would bring about anything, actually. Although in Judaism, I am assured by the late Rabbi Dobin, in Judaism, using astrology to pick the times for doing religious rituals that would have the greatest impact, that was absolutely okay, because the end was good. But doing times for magical rituals such as making sure the enemy dies a horrible and nasty death, or making somebody lose the love of a woman whom you want, or closely related to that, picking an election for casting a spell that will make a woman who currently loathes you want to fall in love with you. This is not okay, and frankly, I'm inclined to agree. I don't have a problem with that. So astrology's ultimate relationship to any religious system depends on the degree to which that religious system has incorporated into it the idea of growth and development of the individual and his or her movement toward a higher state of being. Religions that are about personal growth and development need have no problem with astrology, except, of course, fatalistic astrology. Fatalistic astrology is pretty much against everything. Astrology as a system of yoga. A yoga is a spiritual technology which is designed to bring the individual into harmony and union with the divine. Astrology can most assuredly be a form of yoga as well as carrying out its more common mundane tasks, which are definitely not relevant to religion, except insofar as they make persons aware of higher powers at work in their lives. My father, whom many of you know, got me started in astrology, and then we more or less studied it together. My father was a devout mechanist materialist until he started noticing that astrological stuff worked. And then he said, there are gods. And he changed his mind completely because he had experience. He wasn't doing it on faith. Astrology's idea of entelechy, or entelecheia in Greek, self-realization. The chart is a formal description of the energies that are trying to achieve realization. As I already mentioned, the soul is the final and formal cause of the self, and what this means is the chart properly understood is all of it is a map of the soul. The question is how you define the soul, and the soul has two basic attributes. One is it is the living energy within you, and the other one, it is you. Maybe not you as you are, but you as you ought to become. And who makes the ought? You did. You don't get to choose, you already did. That may sound flip, but it's quite literally true, I believe. So, the astrology of self-realization is actually possibly the most perfect form in which astrology can be used. I have no problems with the practical stuff, none at all. For practical reasons, as well as people suddenly realize there's something bigger going on. And fundamentally, what Aristotle is describing implies that there is somewhere in time and space you perfectly realized pulling who you are now toward it. It's one of those there strange attractors. It may not succeed totally. In fact, it is not even necessary that it succeed. It is only necessary that you keep pointing toward it in your movement. The course of life that unfolds as you do this is what in Greek was called pronoia, and is usually translated as providence, which is a crummy translation. Providence, because providence is usually divine providence, and you could say it's divine. It is divine, but it's not coming from a central source. That's really the problem with the normal distinction of it. It is, in other words, the roadmap or group of roadmaps pointing you toward the definitions that will most fully manifest who you are. Astrology is only truly incompatible with complete atheism. Yep, okay. I have never met an atheist astrologer. Certainly I haven't met one who's thought about what he's doing.
I am an atheist astrologer.
Okay. What God do you not believe in? I've been waiting for this moment. No, literally, I'm not making fun of you. What?
I don't understand your question. What
Okay.
God do I not believe
Yeah,
in?
what is it you do not believe in? Because you see, the notion of God is an extremely debatable concept.
Yeah, maybe, but I'm an atheist.
Wait, but you can't be something you haven't defined.
Why not?
What?
Sorry to bother you.
No, but no, it's
Just,
okay. It's an interesting question.
I really don't think it's incompatible with atheism. Atheism, to me, it means that you don't believe in a God.
Oh God, yes, I agree with you.
So-
That is not my definition of atheism.
Sorry, then.
She's not understanding.
What?
So it's my understanding of it.
Okay, let me give you an alternative. Most people in this culture who are atheists have come to the conclusion that the God taught to them in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam does not exist. I don't have a problem with that. But if it means that there is nothing alive that includes all life and consciousness and all existence at the beginning of all of this, even if it isn't making you dance to its tune, there I find it harder to see how you can accept astrology, given that there is no possible mechanistic explanation for it, at least in my opinion. And of course, this is only my opinion. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, you realize, even if I did make that statement, if I've been waiting for this moment. That was a little flippery. My apologies.
I was like jumped, because
It's what?
I just jumped at that sentence because...
Yeah, I know, I'm sorry.
because-
My humble apologies, please.
No, it's my humble apologies, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
That's an interesting.
You know, when you're in a position like I am at the moment, you can get into debating mode, and sometimes that's not the best thing to do. But I would like you to entertain the possibility that astrology is a language, and a language implies a transmitter and a receiver. We are the receiver. Who is the transmitter? And the answer I usually give is the living energy that constitutes the universe. But it's not a hairy, bearded character on a throne pulling your strings. In fact, it operates entirely through natural law, properly understood. And astrology, I believe, is part of that natural law. So, okay, all I invite you to do is to define what it is you do not believe in. That is all. And you don't have to do it here and now, obviously.
Decide over dinner.
Over dinner, he says. Okay. And again, I apologize for being flippant. That was not right of me. So, in any case, let me define what I mean by complete atheism, and that is that the universe is fundamentally dead and we're a fluke. There's actually a song that has that line in it. Remember the Desiderata, that little scroll that people used to have hanging on their walls a couple decades back? Well, the National Lampoon Radio Dinner album had a parody of it called Deteriorata. And it ended with, "And whether you can see it or not, you are a fluke of the universe." oh, excuse me, you are a fluke of the universe, and whether you can see it or not, the universe is laughing at you behind your back. Except that, of course, implies that there's something out there to laugh, so that's not quite consistent. Is astrology a religion? Oh, let me read some of that previous. You have to distinguish between atheism, meaning disbelief in a particular form of divinity, versus disbelief in any kind of higher form of life and consciousness. The Buddhism, for example, does not believe in God, or at least does not believe that God is the ultimate thing. In fact, none of the manifestations of the Philosophia Perennis believe that there is a God. What there is something way bigger. The God, I won't even say the God beyond God, it's the state beyond God. And I do not believe a person is an atheist if they accept something of that latter type. The true atheism is nihilism. Nothing is significant, nothing is important. Have a good beer, lose consciousness. Might as well. Why? You know? Is astrology a religion? No. Does astrology have religious implications? Yes. Is astrology a kind of spiritual technology? It can be. But it is a vitalist technology, one which works based on a vital, conscious, life-oriented basis rather than materialist, mechanistic foundations. What could be the spiritual role of astrology? And this will be my concluding shot here. The intelligible essence, this is a passage now from these Tobias fragments, which I did not read this morning. I didn't read it all. The intelligible essence, which is nous or mind, then in company with God, which is a very bad word for the thing that's higher than nous. But the Greeks could be sloppy about their terminology too. Has power over itself and power to keep another insofar as it keeps itself. Since essence in itself is not under necessity, which is the middle form of fate I mentioned earlier. You know, the one where you're ignorant. I think I mentioned it earlier. If not, I'll mention it in a moment and you'll see what I mean. But when it falls away from God, when something falls away from God or mind, it takes to itself a corporeal nature. This is not sin, by the way. This is a choice. Its choice being ruled by providence. In other words, an entity can choose the world for some particular task or purpose. And I submit that's what we're all doing. All that is truly irrational tends to be moved toward some reason. That's logos in that case. So the truly irrational gradually assumes a logos. This is, again, Hermes. Reason is according to providence. So reason is an understanding of the order, is an understanding of principles. It's a direct experience of the truth. Unreason to necessity. The less you know, the less you understand, and the more ignorant you are, the more likely your life will be completely controlled. But it's not controlled by something trying to control you. It's controlled in the same way a car is controlled when you let go of the steering wheel. If you let go of the steering wheel in a car, there will be a crash. Maybe only a matter of time, but there will be a crash. On the other hand, if you keep on steering, there probably won't be, assuming you don't get hit by a drunk. And that, of course, is a manifestation of the old principle that you know what happens. If you don't know what I mean, talk to me later. Okay. The things that happen in the corporeal realm fall to fate. Hamar Mene is the fate that governs natural law. And as far as we are physically incarnate, we're under it. I mentioned that this morning. Now, here's a little diagram which I think describes what I call the choice, and this is my concluding shot. Hamar Mene is the result of physical law. And when Greek literature says fate without any characterization, this is usually the word that's used. Sometimes, however, it will be the second one, ananke, necessity. This is due to a lack of gnosis, or gnosis, which means knowing. It is unconscious, in other words. The lack of gnosis is agnoia, or in Sanskrit, avidya. It's exactly the same thing. Ignorance or not knowing. Pronoia is the result of gnosis. So you start out with Hey Marmene, you're stuck with it. You can't do anything about that. Or as again, you don't get to choose, you already did. If you acquire wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, your life will turn into an unfolding of your proper pronoia. If you do not or cannot due to some kind of circumstance, then your life is controlled by an anke, which is the karmic consequence of your lack of understanding. Now, there is a little problem here, of course. As I said before, things happen. And it's very hard to understand, for example, how an entire village of people in certain parts of Africa at certain times are wiped out by idiot malcontents, how that really fits into the scheme. And the only way I can fit it into the scheme is take refuge in the Bhagavad Gita, which is every one of these incidents is simply part of a really intense drama. And it isn't, none of these atrocities are the end of what is happening to those people. But still, we are obliged to do everything we can to stop it. So, astrology, within the bounds of Hey Marmene, which in astrology is when the transits, progressions, and directions happen, with gnosis leads to a proper unfolding of who you really are. Without it, it leads to a completely predetermined life, depending on your ignorance. Very few people are so ignorant as to make it totally determined. But it is theoretically possible. I just don't, but if you're here, you're probably not doing that. I don't want to give you a swelled head or anything, but you've already taken a very large, giant step, unless you're a fatalist medievalist or a fatalist Hindu astrologer, in which case I would say, think again. Okay, I think I've actually managed to inflate this. Yep, 7:04. Din din! Thank you.